With the midterm elections coming up, there is now a battle over election laws, and most importantly, who gets to control them. Now look, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to bring the Federal Election Commission, actually a lot of other agencies, under the scrutiny of the White House. These used to be kind of independent, now they are not. And the Democratic Party, they're now suing over this. And in other news, the Trump administration has paused aid to Ukraine. And this comes after a very tense meeting last week between Trump, Vance, and Zelenskyy. And meanwhile, Trump's tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, they started today, last night, midnight. And he's now saying there's no room for negotiations on it. As this happens, Trump has also announced the United States will oppose tariffs on external agricultural products, meaning foreign food. I'll get into deep diving these stories and more today, so let's get started. Now, first of all, with the midterm elections coming up, there's a legal battle right now starting over election laws. And most importantly, campaign finance. Who controls these things? Who has oversight? Well, President Donald Trump is saying the White House should have oversight. He signed an executive order to bring the FEC, Federal Election Commission, under the scrutiny of the White House. They can decide, should we do this or not? And Democrats, while they argue this will undermine the independence of the FEC and the elections by extension, the FEC is in charge of enforcing campaign finance laws and other things. And a new lawsuit brought by the Democratic Party, well, it could actually soon determine the legalities of Trump's order and, frankly, who runs the elections. Now, Reuters said this. It said U.S. President Donald Trump was sued on Friday by the Democratic Party over a recent executive order it says violates federal election law by giving him too much power over the independent Federal Election Commission. The lawsuit filed in the Washington, D.C. federal court by three national Democratic committees is the party's first against Trump during the Republicans' second White House term. We're only a month in, right? This is the first lawsuit officially from the Democrats. And it says Democrats said enforcing it would essentially substitute Trump's views of election-related disputes for those of the Bipartisan Election Commission and let him dictate outcomes. Now, note as well, Congress created the Election Commission in 1974 in the wake of the Watergate scandal to oversee elections and enforce campaign finance laws. And the complaint quotes then Republican President Gerald Ford, saying both political parties had expressed their pleasure with this bill, noting that it allows them to compete fairly. But according to the complaint, letting Trump micromanage the commission would undermine its purpose by allowing a single partisan political figure to rig campaign rules, they say, and resolve disputes against his opponents. Now look, a bit of background on this. Trump signed an executive order to establish more White House oversight on around 80 independent government agencies. That includes the FEC. It includes a lot of other ones as well. About 2 of those are focused on elections. This is the official fact sheet from the order on February 18th. Here's what the White House statement says. It says, today, President Donald J. Trump signed an executive order ensuring that all federal agencies are accountable to the American people as required by the Constitution. Under this executive order, the order notes that Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution vests all executive power in the president, meaning all executive branch officials and employees are subject to his supervision. That, of course, means all these otherwise independent government agencies, if they're part of the executive branch under the Constitution, they're under the president. They argue, right? And they say this, therefore, because all executive power is vested in the president, all agencies must, 1, submit draft regulations for White House review with no carve-out for so-called independent agencies like the FEC, except, they say, for the monetary policy functions of the Federal Reserve. They gave one exception to it, the Federal Reserve. And also, 2, it says, to consult with the White House on their priorities and strategic plans. And the White House, it says, will set their performance standards. The Office of Management and Budget, OPM, OMB, will adjust so-called independent agencies' appointments to ensure tax dollars are spent wisely. president will get to review all of that. And it says the president and attorney general, subject to the president's supervision and control, meaning Trump would still be technically in control of it even with the AG in there, will interpret the law for the executive branch instead of having separate agencies adopt conflicting interpretations. It notes as well, executive power, the power of the president, without responsibility has no place in our republic. What's a president otherwise? And it says the United States was founded on the principle that the government should be accountable to the people. We elect the president has this function and this power, not unelected bureaucrats. And it says this, that is why the founders created a single president who is alone vested with the executive power and responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It notes as well that voters and the president can now hold all federal agencies, not just cabinet departments, responsible for their decisions as the Constitution demands. Now look, basically, since this is based on a constitutional argument, it's very likely the Democratic lawsuit, it's probably going to head to the Supreme Court eventually. And the basic argument from the Trump side is that, as he mentions, the Constitution in writing does establish powers under the executive branch of the government, mainly under the White House, to ensure that government agencies can be reined in by voters. We elect the president represents us in the democratic process because we are a representative democracy, which is a republic. Now, the other side, the Democrats would argue, well, Congress and the president, under Gerald Ford, created a law that changes this. Can Trump just change it by making an executive order? Does an executive order override legislation approved previously? Well, we will see, because Trump is now arguing that the law created by Congress and Gerald Ford is unconstitutional. That's going to be the debate. Now, the idea right now is to not have rogue agencies that can basically do whatever they want with little accountability and basically nobody to answer to among the voters, which is the argument against these independent agencies. How can you have agencies within the executive branch of our government who don't have to answer to the president, right? Now, like the other side argues that having some separation, well, that helps ensure that whoever's president doesn't get to influence agencies that could benefit themselves politically, right? The FEC, for example, Federal Election Commission. Basically, this would let whoever's in office review laws that could benefit or harm the president or the party they're part of, Democrat or Republican, during an election. Imagine, for example, if Kamala Harris was president and she got to decide on, finance laws that might harm the Republican Party. Would that change people's opinions? I don't know, because that's what Trump's doing right now. And look, of course, the counter argument to that is, well, who in government is not partisan these days? Right? Can you name a single government official who doesn't align with one side of the aisle or the other? The former head of the FEC, Federal Election Commission, even though it was independent, the former head was a vocal critic of Trump. The individual really did not like Donald Trump. Was that a breach of independence? Well, what happens in that case? When an otherwise independent agency risks showing some type of partisan position, does that damage, again, the nonpartisan nature of the agency if partisanship is expressed by its leadership? Who then has oversight to ensure the agency is not acting in partisan interest because the individuals in charge are doing that? How is that different from having the president do it? Well, that's the argument the Supreme Court is very likely going to get to hear as this case moves its way up through the circuit. Now look, leading up to this, Trump took other actions to reform the Federal Election Commission. In particular, what did he do? He fired that chairwoman. He fired her. The FEC, right? That was Ellen Weintraub, who had been in place for about 20 years. Now, she published Trump's January 31st letter online firing her, and this is what it said. It said, quote, "You are hereby removed as a member of the Federal Election Commission, effective immediately. Thank you for your service on the commission." Now, look, in response, she actually tried defying the president and keeping her position regardless of the presidential order. Now, her argument for saying, I'm going to stay in whether you like it or not, her argument was that the President of the United States does not have the authority to remove an FEC commissioner, and that they could only be replaced if they resign or if their terms expire. She said, "Mr. President, you have no power here," basically. Now, Trump's executive order, it seems, changed that because Trump gave himself the power to do that, and it puts the FEC and other agencies under the normal rules of the executive branch, meaning, well, yeah, he can fire her, although that's going to be debated in court now. And it's also on this front that we're seeing the Democrat lawsuit, of course. But look, things also got more complicated from there. It came to light that the commissioner, the one who was fired and then refused to be fired, Ellen Weintraub, well, her appointment had already actually ended a long time ago. She was appointed under President George W. Bush way back in 2002. And here's where it gets a bit complicated. The Hill reported this, quote, "Weintraub's term ended in 2007, but a successor was never appointed to take her spot and allowed her to serve as an acting commissioner for over 20 years. How does that happen? Well, Weintraub tried keeping her position. It does seem her removal did go through. The FEC website currently shows it's 4 active commissioners. There are 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 vacant seats, and she's not there. Now, this is also possibly important for another reason, though. Weintraub was a vocal critic of Trump's various claims on election fraud, especially after the 2020 elections. And these are claims Trump has stood by. He's not backed off that. On the election funding side, money going through campaign finance laws, one of the things the FEC has oversight of, there's some important things with this. There was the Zuck-Bucks scandal of the 2020 elections. A lot of Republicans criticized that for possibly swinging the election in the favor of former President Joe Biden. In 2024, you had the same thing on the other side, right? Trump also had support from Elon Musk. And there were likewise Democrats who criticized some of his lottery-style campaigns as also impacting the outcome of the elections. But there are arguably more significant issues with election finances, I would say are significantly more important, that could actually be impacted under the new changes to the FEC. We're now seeing the vast gray area caused by NGOs, non-governmental organizations that ironically get funding from the government, USAID and otherwise, which raises the question, are they non-government if they're government funded? Well, we're seeing all the politically active groups that were getting money from our government, from our taxes, and many of these were politically involved, including in our elections. Now, there are questions of whether this could amount to partisan campaigns being paid for by American tax dollars. Yes, they're not supposed to be partisan, but many of them are. But there's even more on this. The other big one that has been labeled as, Biden bucks, that's a big one. Biden bucks, anyone remember that? Trump scrapped that program. The argument is that the program, Biden bucks, may have not been mature enough to have impacted the 2024 election, but it could have impacted future elections. This is what the Daily Signal said about that. It said, quote, "The Biden bucks executive order directing federal agencies to boost voter participation have gone the way of the Biden administration." Remember, Biden tried passing that. Well, he did pass it. Trump got rid of it. It said this, President Donald Trump eliminated Executive Order 14019, which President Joe Biden signed in March of 2021, calling for federal agencies to partner with private, quote, voter advocacy groups and to develop, quote, strategic plans. Meaning, look, FEC and these things, third-party organizations, kind of independent, but still under the executive branch. What happens when the government funds organizations that can do things the government cannot, and then makes executive orders to allow these organizations to decide what happens with our elections? That's what this did. Now, note Trump signed what amounted to an omnibus executive order that scrapped almost 80 executive actions taken by Biden. The title was Initial Rescissions of Harmful Executive Orders and Actions. Day one, Trump goes in, nixes all these Biden orders. Now, notice congressional scrutiny and watchdog groups such as the Foundation for Government Accountability, which sued for records on the order, were, quote, enough to slow roll the implementation of the order to ensure that people and not partisan bureaucrats decided the 2024 election, said Stuart Whitson, that's Senior Director of the Federal Affairs for the Foundation. Meaning, basically, Biden created this executive order 2021, Biden bucks, allowing third-party organizations to decide some of the things with our elections. Different Republican actions, conservative actions, different organizations sued, basically blocked that from having an effect, meaning we did not feel it in the 2024 elections, but it was there. And had that been in place, it could have impacted future elections, especially probably the midterms. But he continued saying this, quote, President Donald Trump should be commended for getting rid of the Biden bucks scandal. Whitson told the Daily Signal. He said, quote, this shows the president is committed to stopping weaponized government. Now, the article continues. The author of it writes, as noted in his book, The Myth of Voter Suppression, it says, Demos, a liberal think tank, drafted the Biden initiative and was among the private groups to implement the order, which has been largely shrouded in secrecy. Biden bucks, right? It says Biden's Justice Department also has refused to release its strategic plan, citing presidential privilege in a lawsuit brought by the Foundation for Government Accountability, which is a government watchdog group. It says as well, the House Administration Committee subpoenaed federal agencies for records on how the order was being implemented, but the Biden administration did not comply. They just refused. It says the Daily Signal first reported using various public records requests that under the order, federal agencies cooperated with numerous left-leaning advocacy organizations such as Demos, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, the League of Women Voters, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Stacey Abrams-founded Fair Fight Action, and other organizations. Those were organizations given power under the Biden administration to impact our elections. That was blocked from basically happening in 2024, but that was in place. Where was the FEC on this, right? It notes as well. Many of the records were obtained through requests from states or smaller agencies, meaning there was some public oversight, but it took a lot of work to get it. Now, on that point, this could also tie into what's now happening with the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. If it was possible to create election laws, partnering the government with organizations that are deeply politically partisan, was that also something that undermined the independence of the elections? Remember, independence of the elections, that's the current argument with the FEC. Where were they on that? In that case, look, how did the FEC react to Biden bucks as it was being covered up, as they were refusing to comply with orders, as they were refusing any type of transparency? Where was the FEC? Was that reaction or lack thereof also a partisan decision? Well, these questions and others, they're very likely going to be raised as this case makes its way to the Supreme Court, which it very likely will. Now, personally, I also think it's important to look at these relations, look at these in relation to each other. Not just, free-floating issues. You should see the connections. These actions from the Trump administration, they were closely timed. The firing of the FEC chair, his canceling of the Biden bucks order, and the bringing of the FEC under White House scrutiny. He kind of did those all very quickly, right, in relation to each other. And I'd also say it's likely the legal arguments could tie all these things together as well, especially as it, again, moves forward very likely to Supreme Court. Now, folks, in other news, the Trump administration has now decided to pause all aid to Ukraine, according to a White House official. And look, this follows the very tense meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelenskyy last week. The Epoch Times said this: the United States has paused aid to Ukraine, a White House official told the Epoch Times on Monday. The president, they say, has been clear that he is focused on peace. We need our partners to be committed to that goal as well. We are pausing and reviewing our aid to ensure that it is contributing to a solution, a White House official said. It adds, since fighting erupted between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. has sent at least $175 billion in aid, including cash and military equipment to support Ukrainian defense efforts. An important point on that, a lot of that money actually did not go to defense. A lot of that money went to fund the Ukrainian government and pay their pensions and things like that. And I would say cutting that money off, what does that do? It doesn't just impact the fighting ability of Ukraine, it impacts the happiness, let's say, of all the officials around Zelenskyy. And if people suddenly stop getting their pensions, if they stop getting the paycheck, if they stop getting the money to keep the lights on, well, they might start getting unhappy and they might start demanding change in policy to Zelenskyy. That's what the real impact of that's going to be, at least according to my opinion. Now look, we don't have specific details as to the scope of this pause just yet, but the White House has said that the aid is under review. Vice President J.D. Vance went on Fox News' Sean Hannity last night, and he spoke a bit more about what went down with that meeting last Friday with Zelenskyy, and that the best way for Ukraine to actually have a security guarantee, he says, is by giving Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. Watch this.
What President Trump has said clearly and consistently is, of course, the door is open so long as Zelenskyy is willing to seriously talk peace. You can't come into the Oval Office or anywhere else and refuse to even discuss the details of a peace deal. Look, this is not going to make anybody happy. The Russians are going to have to give up stuff. The Ukrainians are going to have to give up stuff. You can't come to the Oval Office and say, give us security guarantees. We won't even engage with you about what we're willing to give up. That's been the Ukrainian posture. When that posture changes, as President Trump said, when they're willing to talk peace, I think President Trump will be the first person to pick up the phone. If you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest.
Now, on this topic, after Ukrainian President Zelenskyy had his argument with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, he left for Europe. And European leaders are now weighing whether they can sustain Ukraine's war with Russia without the help of the United States. As of now, France and the United Kingdom, the UK, they're proposing that Ukraine consider a one-month partial truce with Russia. It's not clear whether that's going to happen. Because look, on Zelenskyy's side, he's being accused of having blocked the planned ceasefire. He's arguing there can be no peace until Ukraine has a long-term guarantee of peace. And he did suggest he's again open to the mineral deal with the United States. But the Trump administration has said, look, no deal unless you get a peace deal. We're not going to go there and mine minerals while you're still fighting the war, which would just sustain it again. So how's it looking for Europe? Well, the UK Prime Minister is suggesting they might send British troops to Ukraine. And there are polls alleging this has support, although this would be in the context of a peace deal. Daily Mail said this. It said more than half of Britons back sending UK troops to Ukraine, a poll found. Nearly 6 in 10, 58%, told the YouGov survey that they either strongly support or somewhat back UK troops being deployed in the event of a ceasefire deal. That's the caveat here. It says barely a fifth said they opposed such a move. But they note as well it suggests most voters back Sir Keir Starmer after being one of the first European leaders to publicly say that he was ready and willing to put British boots on the ground to enforce any peace deal. YouGov also found that 55% of those Britons who would oppose tax hikes to pay for an increase in defense, awkward because they probably need it, suggesting they would prefer spending cuts elsewhere to pay for it. They don't have the money for it, but they want to do it anyway. Also, Germany is talking about conscripting people, basically bringing back the draft in order to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now look, on this as well, arms companies, all the companies that make weapons, they are making out like bandits. Although this could also be attributed to European countries now looking to increase military spending. The Epoch Times said this. It says shares of European arms giants have risen significantly on the prospect of increased military spending by Union countries. They're probably very happy right now. They get to make more bombs and guns because they might get used. Now, it says the market reacted to a European leaders summit planning a boost in military spending to support Ukraine, sparking a rally in some of the world's largest Europe-based arms companies. On March 3rd, shares in Rheinmetall, Germany's largest defense company, jumped 13.7%, while Leonardo climbed 16% in Milan. France's Thales surged 16%. Britain's BAE Systems jumped 14.5%. If you're invested in the military-industrial complex, the cash is flowing in right now. And it notes the March 2nd summit in London came after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's meeting in the White House on February 28th ended in a heated discussion. The thing fell apart and the arms companies surged. What does that tell you, right? Well, some people may anticipate that a lot more bombs and guns and other things are going to be in high demand. Now, on Zelensky's side, it does seem that he's not hopeful that peace is going to even happen. Now, he was quoted recently saying a deal to end the war between Russia and Ukraine is, quote, very, very far away. He's saying this is going to be a long war. It's just getting started, effectively, right? Now, Trump was quick to criticize that statement, and here's what Trump had to say in a post on Truth Social. He said, quote, "This is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelenskyy, and America will not put up with it for much longer. It is what I was saying. This guy," Zelenskyy says, "doesn't want there to be peace as long as he has America's backing, and Europe, in a meeting they had with Zelenskyy, stated flatly that they cannot do the job without the U.S. They need America to keep it going." And Trump said probably not a great statement to have been made in terms of a show of strength against Russia, that they need America to keep it going. What does it say to Russia, right? Trump said, quote, "What are they thinking?" Now, look, Elon Musk also responded to the back and forth with this. Again, Musk being in charge of Doge. And Musk wrote in a post on X, quote, "Zelenskyy wants a forever war, a never-ending graft meat grinder. This is evil," he said. Now, on the U.S. side, it appears the United States is moving to pull itself out from the conflict. The U.S. is pulling out, basically, money and otherwise. This includes with U.S. defense policies even against Russia. Telegraph said this. It said, Donald Trump's Pentagon chief has ordered a halt to work to counter cyber threats from Russia. It says Pete Hegseth is, again, head of the Department of Defense right now. Instructions are part of a larger reevaluation of all operations against Moscow, U.S. officials said. It says the order to General Timothy Hoff, the command chief in that region, reflects the Trump administration's decision to downplay threats from Russia. Earlier in the week, Leslie Franz, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Cyberspace Security at the Department of State, highlighted China and Iran, but not Russia, meaning the CCP is still a threat, Iran is still a threat. They're no longer regarding Russia as a threat to the United States, not that much at least. It says as the major threat to U.S. infrastructure. It says underpinning the moves is a tilt towards Moscow by the Trump administration, reversing the Biden administration's policy of trying to isolate Russia following the Ukraine invasion. Now look, this goes back to what I've been saying as well. It appears that Trump is looking to pull Russia out from being dependent on the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, the policies to cool U.S. relations with Russia, that could have the effect of breaking the CCP's control over Russia because Russia has no place else to go right now. They can't go to Europe. They can't go to the U.S. They're basically limited to the CCP's, third world network of countries. And even if Russia meets with one of these countries, the CCP punishes them. Meaning Russia is in a position it doesn't want to be. It's forced to be there because of maybe its bad decisions, but it's forced there. And so the Trump administration is recognizing the Iranian regime, the Chinese Communist Party as major threats, not lesser threats, but it is saying we can pull Russia out of that. It seems that is the message. Now, in response to some of the criticism now going around, particularly from European countries. While Trump wrote this on Truth Social, he said, quote, "Europe has spent more money buying Russian oil and gas than they have spent on defending Ukraine by far." Meaning, look, you're accusing the U.S. of pulling money out. You guys have been funding Russia because you put your money in all these green policies that don't sustain your energy industry, and so you're buying it from Russia. You're funding Russia while accusing us of pulling money out from Ukraine. Now, Trump followed that by saying, quote, "The only president who gave none of Ukraine's land to Putin's Russia is President Donald J. Trump." He said, "Remember that when the weak and ineffective Democrats criticize and the fake news gladly puts out anything they say. Historically, remember the conflict in Ukraine started in 2014 when Barack Obama was president. And Ukraine, again, lost some territory to Russia during that time. That was not under Trump, that was under Obama. And then, of course, under Biden, they restarted the war." That's Trump's argument with this. Now, Trump also added, quote, "We should spend less time worrying about Putin and more time worrying about the migrant rape gangs, drug lords, murderers, and people from mental institutions entering our country." Trump again alleges a lot of the people who've illegally entered the U.S., they're prisoners, mental patients, and so on, who are just being forced from their countries to get out because their own countries don't want them, and so they're sending them here. And so Trump said, quote, "So that we don't end up like Europe," meaning that Europe is dealing with rape gangs and murderers and terrorists and so on, and America doesn't want that. He's suggesting that is more of a concern for us. And frankly, if you look at the death tolls, 70,000 Americans killed every year by fentanyl. Some say even higher. Trump is saying 100,000 now. That's more people than a war. We are losing Americans on the scale of a war because of these open border policies and because of the lax stuff on stopping drugs from entering our country, right? Now, like on that point with Trump's statements on the threats from drug trafficking, mass migration, other problems, well, he's also taking action on that front. His previously delayed tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China over mass migration and fentanyl, those have now gone into effect. They went into effect at midnight. I'll be talking more about this after we come back from a 1-minute break, so don't go anywhere.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Folks, Trump's very large tariffs are now in effect. They have begun. Now, Trump has repeatedly sounded the alarm on the threats from drug trafficking, mass migration, other problems, and he's also taking actions on that front. His previously delayed tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China over mass migration and fentanyl, those tariffs have now gone into effect as of last night, midnight. Now, these tariffs, that's the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, just about everything, and the doubling of the additional 10% tariffs on Chinese imports. And remember, although it's less for China, we also import a lot more from them. These were announced in a Truth Social post by Trump back on February 27th. And Trump said this, he said, quote, "Drugs are still pouring into our country from Mexico and Canada at very high and unacceptable levels. A large percentage of these drugs, much of them in the form of fentanyl, are made in and supplied by China. More than 100,000 people died last year due to the distribution of these dangerous and highly addictive poisons." And he said, quote, "Millions of people have died over the last 2 decades. He said the families of the victims are devastated and in many instances virtually destroyed. We cannot allow this scourge to continue to harm the USA, and therefore, until it stops or is seriously limited, the proposed tariffs, scheduled to go into effect on March 4th, today, will indeed go into effect as scheduled. He said China will likewise be charged an additional 10% tariff on that date. Now, the day has come. There's no wiggle room on that at all. It is now in effect. Trump told reporters yesterday that there was no room for last-minute negotiations to prevent them either. Watch this.
No room left for Mexico or for Canada. No, the tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow. And just so you understand, vast amounts of fentanyl have poured into our country from Mexico. And as you know, also from China, where it goes to Mexico and goes to Canada. And China also had an additional 10, so it's 10 plus 10. And it comes in from Canada and it comes in from Mexico. And that's a very important thing to say. Yeah, please.
In addition to this, Trump also announced yesterday the United States will impose tariffs on external agricultural products starting next month. On Truth Social, Trump said, quote, "To the great farmers of the United States, get ready to start making a lot of agricultural products to be sold inside of the United States. Tariffs will go on external product on April 2nd. Have fun." Now look, we don't know yet what these tariffs are going to look like or what products they're going to affect, but this could be a big move. Basically, this is going to affect all the food produced in the United States and produced around the world. Anybody trying to import or export food into the United States, they're going to get hit with tariffs. American farmers can sell lower, make more money, and it'll be easier for them to compete against all these foreign companies. Now look, on top of that, Trump is also looking to move the auto manufacturing industry back to the United States. That could be a pretty big blow to the Mexican economy because the auto industry is one of the core pieces of their economy. In fact, they just moved the Honda production from Mexico to the United States. And there's more to this as well. Trump's policies to, quote, drill, baby, drill, that could also impact both Canada and Mexico. And on top of that, for Canada, which depends on exporting oil and timber to the United States as basically most of its economy, Trump just took moves to restore U.S. dominance in the timber industry, meaning oil, timber, energy, the things that Canada exports to us, they can't compete probably soon, and they're going to get tariffed on it. Trump signed an executive order last week for the immediate expansion of American timber production, saying, quote, "The production of timber, lumber, paper, bioenergy, and other wood products, timber production, is critical to our nation's well-being. Timber production is essential for crucial human activities like construction and energy production. Americans still build a lot of their homes with wood. A lot of countries like in Europe, they don't do that. We use a lot of timber." And Trump said, quote, "Furthermore, as recent disasters demonstrate forest management and wildfire risks, reduction projects can save American lives and communities." Meaning, if we start making timber production, you might clear out some of that underbrush and manage the forest better, meaning fewer forest fires. And not only that, Trump also signed an order, quote, "addressing the threat to national security from imports of timber and lumber." And notes this order basically instructs the Secretary of Commerce to investigate, quote, "how imports of timber, lumber, and their derivative products threaten America's national security and economic stability." Now look, folks, on this, the national security aspect of these is interesting. The White House fact sheet says the President Trump recognizes that an over-reliance on foreign timber, lumber, and their derivative products could jeopardize the United States defense capabilities, construction, industry, and economic strength. And it notes the United States has been a net importer of lumber since 2016. Technically when Trump's first term in office, despite having the practical production capacity to supply 95% of the United States 2024 softwood consumption, meaning we mostly don't even need to import some, but not much. It notes that foreign supply chains and major exporters increasingly fill U.S. demand, creating vulnerabilities to disruptions. What happens if it gets cut off? America's reliance on imported lumber is exacerbated by foreign government subsidies and predatory trade practices, which undermine the competitiveness of the U.S. wood products industry, meaning other countries subsidize it, they pay it, meaning American companies can't even compete with it. They put us out of business. They put Americans out of business. They make a lot of money because, again, we consume a lot of wood. And Trump wants to deal with that foreign influence as well, where governments are subsidizing their companies to put Americans out of business. Now, note as well, basically, Trump has a lot of tariffs in the pipeline. We've been talking about it. There's new ones all the time. We'll have to see how other countries react, once the specifics are out. But this could see some pretty big shifts in the global economy. We're seeing a lot of big changes right now. Tariffs, the elimination of things that have been undermining American competitiveness and so on. All of this is changing. And a lot of countries that have been kind of living off of taking advantage of Americans, well, they're dealing with a very different reality now. We'll have to see what the impact of it is. And folks, again, we'll be keeping updates on this. That said, hit the like button, leave a comment. Let's jump into some questions. All right, first question, Martin McKenzie. You're saying, did the West make a huge mistake back in the 1990s by not cutting back NATO and not embracing a non-communist Russia? It seems to me that we doubled down on security when the threat was gone. It's a bit more, it is a bit complicated. Some people, I've noted this as well, would note what they call, some people have referred to as the perestroika deception. That when Russia did away with communism, it didn't really do away with communism. They basically, the KGB became the Russian mafia, right? They just went into crime. The former communist leadership became the mafia and the oligarchy. Because what happened, right? Communism collapses. People are going to look to, control the free market. What happens when you have basically all the money is held by the communist leadership? What do you do with that? The people who had money in the former Soviet Union were the communist officials. What happens when they adopt a free market? Well, the people with money, the former communist officials, go and buy up all the elements of the free market. They buy the businesses, they buy the land, they buy the natural resources that are going to fuel the future industries. Meaning, the former communist leadership stayed in power. Just they began controlling the, quote-unquote free market by creating a monopoly. The same type of abuse you had under the KGB and the Soviets, they just became gangsters. Now many people would argue they were already gangsters, and so the jump from that was not very big. They went from killing and, torturing and taking money from people under the auspices of the government to just doing it under gangs. Now, the other side of it is when NATO was formed, not NATO, when the United Nations was formed, you also had a lot of these former Soviet, former communist officials, even current communist officials, go in, and they found their ideas aligned very closely with the globalist ideas of the UN. And so a lot of these communist officials, yes, communism ended, but a lot of those same officials who led the communist parties just became very influential leaders of globalism. And so, yeah, communism, quote unquote, ended. The Soviet Union ended. But what happened? Well, the people in power gained greater power over the economies of Europe, over the policies that impact things to the United Nations for, most of the quote unquote developing world. And then you have communist countries like the Chinese Communist Party get supercharged by foreign business from the United States and Europe and everybody else. We began supercharging one of the largest communist powers, and it then began using its power to undermine the basic free markets and principles of the rest of the world. And so the idea that the Cold War was over was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. But on that point, now there are attempts to change it. You might remember during the Obama administration, they had the New START Treaty. They did try making a fresh start of diplomatic relations with Russia. Some argue, as with the Obama administration, that Russia undermined that when, in 2014 they did invade Ukraine. Now, others would argue that that was in response to the color revolution started through, Soros-connected organizations and otherwise. And they would argue that that triggered Russia to do it. Believe which side you want, right? Believe which side you want. And so things have never been really as cut and dry as they appear on the surface. It wasn't even just Ukraine. It was Estonia. There were other countries as well related to, some of these incursions. And so on that side, things are kind of messy. It's not just purely black and white issues, right? I would actually argue that pushing Russia away from the free world and making it so it had to go to China was a terrible policy. If anything, that actually made Russia more dangerous and more of a threat to the West, and actually kind of created that problem because, basically because they have no place else to go. They can't ruin their relations with China. And so the CCP has been able to largely control a lot of the policies of Russia. Russia doesn't have a choice unless they want to be sidelined and go back to being like basically a third world country. Some would argue they kind of are. But they teeter on it. They really teeter on it. They're in a very difficult position. If they can reopen relations with the United States, a lot of this could change. Some people would argue that Trump had that opportunity back in 2016. The problem Trump had in his first term of office is because of the fake Trump-Russia scandal, which, again, they maintained for his entire first term in office. It only went away at the very end, right before the 2020 elections. That went through his entire first term. They tried impeaching him over it. They investigated him over it. It turned out the entire thing was fake, being run by, it started as, of course, Democrat Party opposition research, which was fabricated. They fabricated it. And it was spread by the FBI, by, again, the Democratic Party, and by political operatives. And it was used to undermine Trump's entire first term in office. But it also had the effect of stopping U.S.-Russian relations. It prevented Trump from cooling ties with Russia and making it so that maybe the invasion of Ukraine would not have happened, right? Now, when Trump comes out and talks about this, that's what he says. Now, briefly on the Trump-Russia scandal, remember, there were counter investigations on it. Trump also had a special counsel appointed to investigate it. They determined, yes, it was all fake, but they said that there was no malicious intent, right? It was no malicious intent. It was confirmation bias. People wanted so bad for Trump to be guilty that they just believed it, right? That was the allegation. We'll see if that holds up if Trump wants to reinvestigate, which it seems they are, by the way. But case in point, that's what happened. That's what stopped U.S.-Russian relations. That's what stopped Russia from being able to be part of the free world. And Trump, I think, would argue that's what created the conditions that led to this entire war in the first place. Trump has argued repeatedly this should have never happened. It was preventable, and it should have never happened. He keeps repeating that, right? That's his line. It should have never happened. He just keeps repeating it. And it's on that ground. Now, that said, what is the solution? Does the U.S. maintain this Russia is our greatest enemy stance, or do we try to cool relations to pull them out from that and make them part of the free world? What is a better solution, right? That's where things are at diplomatically right now. And, from Trump's side, when you look at who is hostile to the United States, when you look at who aligns with U.S. values, who opposes them, you have actually kind of a different way of looking at the world. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party represents basically global communism. They regard us as their biggest enemy, but we've been trading with them and investing with them for since going back to Nixon, basically. We've maintained that. Trump regards the CCP, as do Democrats. This is basically nonpartisan now. Basically is the main enemy of the United States, them and Iran. They're maintaining that. But where does Europe sit? Where does Russia sit? Now, Europe, Western Europe, they're very closely aligned with the Democrat Party. I would actually say that the Russia, Western Europe issue is more an issue not of like military hostilities, but more of like partisan politics. Western Europe represents mass migration, the trans policies, the LGBTQ, identity politics. All the things of the Biden administration are still entrenched in Western European principles. And, socialism light, a lot of those policies are also entrenched in Western European principles. That is very closely aligned with the policies of the Democratic Party. And so partisan-wise, they're more aligned with that side of the U.S. system. Russia, it has been pushed to align with China to become an enemy of the United States. Trump seems to be trying to change that because I think politically he sees that maybe they could change and maybe they could align more with conservative values. Now, there's arguments on that, right? I talked about the perestroika deception. I talked about the problem you have that, yes, they're a former communist country and a lot of the communists stayed in power in different ways. They deal with those problems. But frankly, most of Europe does too. It's not just a Russia thing. It's even Western Europe is like very socialist. Trump is dealing with that issue, but I think he believes that Russia, if given an opening, can align more with Western free market values, can align more with conservative values, and I think he believes that if he changes relations with them, that they can change. Personally, from my own stance, I would say that if Trump can break CCP control of Russia, that is a good thing. And for me, that's the biggest issue. I think this is kind of a reverse of what Nixon did, where Nixon broke the Sino-Soviet alliance, right? Trump is now breaking the Russia-CCP alliance. I think that would be a positive thing if Russia could actually break from the control of the CCP and not work as a proxy of it. And I think that has to be part of the policy with Trump if he wants to change this. Otherwise, the CCP will use Russia as like a Trojan horse, right? That is, I think, security-wise, the big concern. If they allow the CCP to continue to influence Russia, it will work like a Trojan horse. And so that needs to be broken if this is going to work. It's a very delicate picture, and I don't see it as purely black and white. I don't see this as a purely black and white thing, right? Cynthia RK, you're saying China scares me more than Russia does. Yeah, me too, right? Seymour Butts, and I saw it was your birthday recently, Seymour, so happy birthday. You said way back it seemed that one person had some ideas and another person had some different ideas. We listened to both sides, voted for the one we liked, and then whichever one, we all got behind those ideas to help make America better. For some reason that has changed. It's more like two rival football teams. No matter what the other team does, the other team is against it, even if it is good for the country. Personally, I'd say this is where moderate politics come back into place. The challenge is this. Currently, when people talk about moderate politics, what they think that represents is an accepting of the extremes. I would actually argue that moderate politics should discard the extremes. Meaning, I would say the trans stuff, like full-term abortion stuff, I'd say that's pretty dang extreme. On the far right, you also have basically National Socialism making a comeback. You do have some people like that. I would say these are the extremes. And I'd say those extremes do not reflect the opinions of the majority of Americans. A lot of people think that if you go to the middle, it means that you're accepting those extremes, when I would argue it doesn't. I would actually argue most of America is in the middle, but they identify the opposition in relation to the furthest parts of those ideologies. I would actually say that if you're more moderate, the swing is less, right? You got to imagine if you have two extremes, it's going to pull your country apart, right? If you go towards the middle more, the breadth of the distance is not as great. It doesn't swing like this, it swings like this. Now, to achieve that, I would say that both sides need to discard the crazies. And Look, I know Trump gets labeled as extreme. I would actually say he's becoming more moderate, and I would actually say this is why he's capturing a lot of moderate voters. I would say that's why he's capturing third-party voters. I'd say that's why he's capturing a lot of the black vote and the Hispanic vote. It's because he's resonating with the average Americans who tend to be more moderate. If you go to like middle America, and look, I travel a lot for Crossroads. I talk to a lot of people. If you get outside the cities, you'll find in a lot of places that people don't really care that much about partisan politics. You get to like small town America, it's like, yeah, the neighbor, I don't agree with his lifestyle, but he's my neighbor, and you can't pick your neighbors, and we gotta stick by each other. That's the character of a lot of our country, right? If you get outside the bubble, that is the character of a lot of Americans. I would point to RFK Jr. He's a Democrat. I don't think he's changed at all on that front, other than he's against corruption. I'd say he's against. He's against, ironically, the big businesses that he thinks are poisoning Americans. That used to be kind of like a hippie stance. He's a bit unlike that side, right? But he's with Trump. Now, is that a moderate position? I would say it is. What about Elon Musk? Elon Musk is more of a libertarian, I think, right? At least in my opinion. He's more like a libertarian. Live and let live. I don't really care what you do, but I don't want to see you blowing my money. It's a very libertarian idea. I'd say some would say it's not moderate, but I'd say it's moderate because libertarians are technically classical liberals. If you take classical liberalism, that's libertarianism, right? You take people like Joe Rogan. He used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. Joe Rogan used to be a Bernie bro. He's all behind Trump now, it seems. Has he changed in his ideas? I don't think so. I think he's actually very moderate. Well, I think Bernie Sanders is not moderate, but I think Joe got off that bandwagon, right? My point is, I really think we are returning as a country back to centrism. I really think we are. And I think with that return, the extremes are going to fade out a bit. And you can see it happening. You can see the extreme movements, right? The LGB movement, I guess, I don't know how you call them anymore. They got rid of the T. They got rid of the T, at least, right? That got booted out of the party. They got kicked out of the party. If you look, for example, at the Republicans, the alt-right got kicked out as well. And a lot of them don't like Trump. A lot of them really don't like Trump. They booted those guys too. I would say that actually happened even during Trump's first term in office. And so I do think you are seeing the extremes kind of losing influence. They're becoming, fringe, right? And you are, I think, seeing a return to political moderatism. I do think that's happening, and I do think that actually aligns more with the character of most Americans. I'd consider myself pretty moderate. My standard is what many people in the past would say. Confucianism would say it. A lot of the old Romans would say it. The golden mean would say it, right? I have my standards. I do hold myself to pretty high standards. I don't meet them all the time. I beat myself up over it when I don't do well enough. But I don't hold other people to my standards. I don't believe other people need to believe what I believe, right? I don't believe other people need to align with my values. I do not hate people who think differently than me. I don't look down on them. I do speak my mind, right? But I don't try to force it on people. I understand that people are different. I don't think that's a bad thing. I would not want a world where everybody is forced to become like me. I don't want that. I think the differences among us is what makes life interesting, frankly. And sometimes people have bad days. Having a bad day might make them treat me badly. It doesn't mean they're bad people either. You know what I mean? That's kind of my outlook on life, right? And I think most Americans are like that, actually. I really do. Denise B., you're saying, politics has become a modern-day sport. It's no longer important to play fair and do your best. It's only important that you beat up the opposing team. Yeah, and I do think, again, back to that point that needs to change. You need to hold your ground, right? But you can't do it even when you're wrong. It's fine to admit that maybe we all have some issues. Let's be honest with ourselves, right? And acknowledging our issues sometimes helps us improve as people, and that is healthy for personal development. All right, folks. I went a bit long today on the news part. There's so much happening right now that it's hard to keep up with. And sometimes when there's a lot to talk about, I do want to go more into that. So we have less time for questions today. I do apologize. But hey, that's why we do the show every day, right? So that said, join me tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Always a pleasure with y'all. Please don't forget to like this video, share this video, tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. It helps us a lot. And that said, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.